Okay, so let's dive right in. We're going to be exploring Russell Kirk's classic book, The Conservative Mind. Now, this isn't really about party politics. Instead, it's about a deep intellectual tradition, an idea that fundamentally shaped both Britain and America. What Kirk does is trace this entire family tree of thought, showing how it all grew from a single, powerful idea born in a moment of absolute crisis.
But first, we kind of have to start here. You've probably heard this one before. The famous liberal thinker John Stuart Mill once called conservatives the stupid party. And that label, it really stuck. It paints this picture of a movement that, just wants to stand in the way of progress. So is that fair? Does conservatism actually have an intellectual foundation? Well, Kirk argues that it absolutely does, and it is anything but stupid.
So where does this story begin? According to Kirk, it doesn't start with some grand, carefully worked-out theory in a quiet library. Nope, it starts with a bang. It was a visceral, gut reaction to one of the most chaotic events in history, the French Revolution. It wasn't planned. It was basically an emergency response. You have to picture the time. The late 18th century was electric with these huge radical ideas. Thinkers, known as the philosophers, were convinced that you could just wipe the slate clean, that you could redesign society from the ground up using nothing but pure reason. They truly believed in the perfectibility of man. But when those ideas were actually put into practice in France, the dream of utopia very quickly became the nightmare of the terror. And it was that explosion of chaos that demanded an answer. And here's where it gets really interesting. At the time, revolutionaries like Thomas Paine actually looked at Edmund Burke, who was this famous champion of liberty, and they thought, hey, he's one of us. He's going to love this. They were sure he'd support their cause in France. Oh boy, were they wrong. Burke's response would do the exact opposite. It would lay the very cornerstone for modern conservative thought. So it really fell to Burke to be the first to explain, okay, here's what it means to be a conservative in this crazy new world. And let's be clear, he wasn't defending tyranny or arguing for absolute monarchs, not at all. He was defending something much more complex, this inherited social order that he believed was the only real thing protecting human freedom. Kirk boils Burke's whole philosophy down to these 6 core principles. You can see they cover a lot of ground, from a respect for tradition all the way to a deep suspicion of radical sweeping change. And really, all of it is built on one foundational belief: the humble recognition that human beings are not perfect. Okay, let's stop for a second because that word prejudice just jumps right off the screen, doesn't it? In our world, that's a bad word, full stop. But to understand Burke, you have to get what he meant by it, because for him, it wasn't just a good thing, it was absolutely crucial. For Burke, prejudice wasn't about bigotry. Think of it more like the collective wisdom of our ancestors, baked right into our culture. It's our gut feelings, our instincts, the morals we take for granted. It's the wisdom of the species that lets us make good decisions without having to have a 2-hour philosophical debate every time we're faced with a problem. He trusted that deep, inherited wisdom way more than the cleverness of any single person. And that ties directly into this next idea, prescription. This is pretty simple, actually. It's the idea that if something, an institution, a right, a custom, has been around for, as he put it, time out of mind, then it has authority. Not because some genius designed it, but because it has been tested by reality, over and over, for generations, and it survived. It's been road-tested. Wow. This quote just perfectly captures Burke's greatest fear. He wasn't afraid of reason itself. He was terrified of the thoroughbred metaphysician. The abstract intellectual who loves humanity in theory, but can't stand actual messy human beings. The kind of person who would happily tear down a working society just to build a new one that looks perfect on paper. He saw that as a truly dangerous kind of arrogance. All right, so Burke laid the foundation, but this was just the beginning. Now let's see what happened as this idea started to travel, as it crossed the Atlantic and had to face totally new challenges. And you can see that progression right here. As Burke is publishing his work in the UK, John Adams is grappling with very similar ideas in the brand new United States. Then you fast forward a few decades and you've got Benjamin Disraeli in Britain, taking these same principles and applying them to the harsh new world of the Industrial Revolution. So this shows you it wasn't a static, dead doctrine. It was a living, breathing way of thinking. Over in America, John Adams was making the case for what he called a natural aristocracy. Now, he wasn't talking about kings and dukes. He meant that in any society, some people are just naturally more suited to lead. They have the virtue, the talent,
And he believed that for a republic to survive, it needed to elevate those people to serve as a check on the passions and impulses of the moment.
Meanwhile, back in Britain, the Industrial Revolution was ripping society apart. Disraeli looked around and saw what he called two nations, the rich and the poor, who had nothing in common anymore. He fought against this breakdown, arguing that a nation is more than just an economy. He said it's a spiritual community bound together by tradition and loyalty, where the wealthy have a real duty to care for the poor.
So if you boil all this down, Kirk's big argument is that the central conflict here isn't really between left and right, not in the way we use those terms today. No, he says it's a much deeper, much more fundamental clash between two completely different ways of seeing the world. And you can see the two sides laid out here. On the one hand, you've got the conservative view. It starts by saying humanity is flawed, so we should rely on tradition and make changes slowly and carefully. It sees society as a kind of living organism. On the other hand, you have the radical view, which believes humanity is perfectible, and tradition just gets in the way. It sees society as a machine that can be taken apart and rebuilt to be perfect.
So in the end, Kirk's book is much more than just a history lesson. It's really framing a debate that is just as intense today as it was back in 1790, and it's asking questions that we are still very much trying to answer. And really, this is the crucial takeaway. The real dividing line, according to Kirk, isn't between Democrats and Republicans. It's between two different sources of authority. Do you put your faith in the inherited, accumulated wisdom of the past, in tradition? Or do you put your faith in the power of your own abstract reason to build a better world from scratch? That's the fundamental question the conservative mind leaves us with. And that leads me to one final thought for you. We live in an age that worships innovation. The whole mantra of our time is disrupt everything, move fast and break things. Kirk's work forces us to stop and ask a pretty uncomfortable question. Are there some things that shouldn't be broken? In our relentless race for what's new, are there some timeless truths, some enduring structures that are worth holding on to, worth coming back to?